Welcome, everybody. Sorry for the delay. Just had some tech set up, but I think we're good now. So for our guests in-house and for our guests online, welcome to beautiful Boardman Performing Arts Center. It's going to be a special night. You know, I kind of laugh when I think about the two letters CP. I started here as a high school principal, and if you would ask me what CP was, I would have said it's college prep. And then if you asked me what CP meant when a week ago, I would have said it's COVID protocol. But tonight, CP has meant something special since about the spring of 2019. And for us, it means hope, it means fairness, and it means funding. It means Cup-Patterson. And we're definitely blessed to have one of the two main people in the Cup-Patterson Fair Funding Formula here to speak to us. But before we begin, just I want to give, again, a welcome. I do want to acknowledge a couple of my colleagues out here. I have Superintendent Don Mook and Superintendent Matt Bowen here tonight. Appreciate them coming, and also board member Frank Zetz here from the Boardman Local Schools. Just a couple other items. There will be an opportunity to ask questions for our viewers online. You'll place those in the comments section of the YouTube channel. Those are turned off for now, but when we get to the point in the program that you can ask questions, we'll turn that comments section on and monitor anything that's input in there and be able to ask that on your behalf. Also would like you to just check your cell phones quickly, just to make sure those don't interrupt tonight's presentation flow. The next person to speak works for the Mahoning County Educational Service Center, Nick Santucci, who is the Director of Government Affairs and Workforce Development. Nick, please come up to the podium. COVID protocol.
Thank you, Superintendent, and good evening to everybody. Thanks for having us tonight. It's exciting to have Representative Patterson here to discuss House Bill 305. Like the Superintendent said, I'm Nick Santucci. I'm the Director of Government Affairs and Workforce Development for the Mahoning County Educational Service Center. On behalf of Tracy Hostetler, who's the Superintendent of the ESC, she wishes she could be here, but she was not able to make it tonight. I joined the ESC in May of 2020, of course, and Tracy and the board and the administration at the ESC recognized the importance of raising awareness of some of the work that we're doing in the education arena with our policymakers. And so I've been working very hard to be that conduit between the policymakers and our education space. And so we've really made huge strides, and we've created these educate and advocate events. Every month we bring in a policymaker to come in and speak to superintendents and principals and administrators to talk about the needs of education. And so we were happy to partner with Boardman Schools, and we appreciate them hosting tonight and creating collaboration. The whole idea behind those events are to align and support education priorities, increase advocacy efforts, and of course, increase the collaboration between the school districts and the aligned districts at the ESC. I'd like to also recognize Representative Al Catrona here tonight, so appreciate his attendance in person. And I'd like to introduce Representative John Patterson, if that's okay. State Representative John Patterson is currently serving his fourth term in the Ohio House of Representatives. He represents the 99th House District, which includes portions of Ashtabula and Geauga counties. Representative Patterson retired in June 2012 from teaching U.S. history at Jefferson Area High School for 29 years. During his time at Jefferson, Representative Patterson was active in the Jefferson Area Teachers Association. He was the chief negotiator for his union from the late 1980s until his retirement. Rep. Patterson received his bachelor's degree from Marietta College and his master's degree in political science, American government from Ohio University. Representative Patterson earned his PhD in education from Kent State University. He has instructed undergraduate courses at Kent State and also has taught at the graduate level for Gannon University. Rep. Patterson and his wife, Nancy, have been married 35 years and are the parents of Joshua and Jeremiah. Please help me welcome Representative Patterson here tonight. Thank you.
Well, it is certainly a pleasure to be here this evening. I want to thank Boardman High School for welcoming me so kindly and for the wonderful introduction. I must admit I have to update that because I've been now married 37 years, happily married, and if my wife were in the audience, she might agree with that. Because, as Representative Catruna knows, this job sometimes puts a little strain on those relationships that we value at home. But it is indeed my pleasure to be with you here tonight and virtually with others online. So we're going to dive right into this. We're going to use as a basis a slideshow or a slide presentation that BASA, OASBO, and OSBA used a week ago Friday, and then I'm going to supplement that with, you have a handout that accompanies that. I'll merge those two together, and then there's one other slide that is independent yet, and that has to do with the base cost. So, Fair School Funding Plan. You see the first slide up there. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. These are the legislators who are the principal players, and you can see we have Senators Lehner and Sykes in the Ohio Senate, who are the joint sponsors of SB 376. Now, a quick note here, 376 is the same as the -6 substitute version that we accepted in the House Finance Committee last week. The as-introduced version, the original 305, has been modified now. It's on its 6th iteration, but 376 and -6 are the same. You can see that former teacher in the middle, and then my new partner in crime, Representative Scheer, took over when I lost former representative, now Speaker Cup, to that position. So it's been a great transition, and as I tell everybody who comes on board, this is like the Hotel California. When you're dealing with school funding, you can check out, but you can never leave. And these folks are all on call 24/7, and I have called them at strange times. The presenters, these are some folks that I want you to know. You can go to the next slide. We have had, and you're going to see this shortly, a work group help coordinate this whole effort with us. But Tom Hostler, one of the lead folks with Perrysburg, Ryan Pendleton, obviously a treasurer, and then Mike Sobel, a name you're probably very well familiar with. But let's go to the next slide. I want them to be able to see the subgroups. And a quick note here. When Representative Cupp and I first started, this is 3 years ago now, we knew that in the budget proceedings, you can't do what is necessary for school funding in the normal telescope time of the budget hearings, which for us on the primary, secondary subcommittee on finance is about 5 weeks. So we reached out to you, to practitioners, to guide us through. And this definitely is dear to my heart because when I was teaching, when I was coaching, when I was advising, I would always ask my students what needs to be improved, and they will tell you, and it's usually best to go to the people who are impacted most. So as opposed to state legislators giving you a top-down approach, we ask this group to come together, and you can see the 8 different subgroups there that dealt with this for over a 3-year period now to advise us. Who better to advise us than those of you who do this every day for a living? And so I want you to know this is a grassroots effort, which makes it so very special from the bottom up. Next slide, please. So there are 3 components here that we're going to cover, and I want to make sure as we go through that I answer your questions. If there's a serious question, we can do it right as we go, or if something comes to mind, we can address it later. But base cost, we need to spend some time with base cost, And then secondly, with the state local share calculations, and then finally with the categorical aids. So we'll do that with these. Next slide, please. Critical values. We wanted to be able to figure out, and this was one of the holdings of DeRolf, what does it cost to educate a typical child in a typical school district? Well, where are my treasurers out there right now? Any treasurers? 6,020, right? Where does that come from? For the base costs that we've been using. From ODE, how do they calculate it? They think they have a formula. If that was a trick question, I'm sorry. No, nobody knows how it's calculated. It was as a result of residual funding. And as a result, we knew we didn't want to go in that direction. I apologize that I shouldn't have put you on the spot. But I've asked experts around the state, Mike Sobel, Howard Fleeter, how's this come from? Well, we think it's a result of residual funding. If you were going to buy something, say a new automobile or a house or something, or a remodeling project, where do you start? You start with asking the question, how much does it cost? What are the components? What does it cost? And let's put this all together. And that's what we did from the ground up. And you'll see that when we get into base costs. We also wanted to make sure that students could reach their full potential. Now, we were talking here earlier about when the budget cuts typically come. Where are my school board members here tonight? Or superintendents? I know we have a few soups here. You have to start with making tough decisions, correct? We have 2 superintendents, and I'm going to count you, Terry, as a superintendent, just for a moment before we demote you back to serving under your esteemed colleague, okay? So when the budget cuts come, you have to make some difficult decisions. And let me ask you this. When it comes to making those decisions, you would probably, and I'm thinking now from my old negotiator standpoint, chief negotiator from our union, you're probably going to have to decide what is critically essential to keep. And if I'm you, it's going to be anything related to the state report card because you get judged on that, correct?
Big piece of it.
It's a big piece of it. So if there were a consumer science class or vocational agriculture class or art, music, and gym, if you had to make tough decisions, you don't have to say this, but my wife taught 35 years physical education in the elementary school. Her fear was always that would get cut because it's deemed as not as essential as some of the others, correct? Well, my point is, we have shortchanged students by forcing you to cut these programs that are essential to their overall learning. And one of the things that we wanted to ensure was that each child gets a quality education that we can offer them to fulfill their destiny when they become citizens and enter the workforce. So that was critical to us as well. And I'll give you the full sermon a little bit later with respect to the purpose of education. Also, we wanted a stable funding formula that's predictable, that's sustainable, that's scalable. And predictability is critical for treasurers and superintendents. One of the things that always bothered me when I was negotiating, and I would sidebar with the superintendent, John, I'd like to help you, but keep in mind, we have say it with me, 5-year forecast, and the state only operates on a 2-year budget. We don't know what they're going to do 2 years from now. How can we promise you anything? You're right. And that's one of the flaws in the current formula that we have. It is not predictable. We don't know what's going to happen from one cycle to the next. And as a result, you are put into a position of making very difficult decisions over the power over which you have very, very little. So we want to make sure it's stable. And then the other critical value, the dollars need to flow exactly where the kids are educated. So let's get right into this whole notion of the base cost. Next slide, please. Second bullet point I'm going to highlight. Next slide. All right, the whole student. We've calculated into this formula extracurriculars. We've calculated librarians. We've calculated school resource officers. We've calculated counselors, social, emotional, mental health experts. Every component of a basic cost is here. What's it cost to run a building? What's it cost for a typical superintendent? You need an EMIS coordinator. How many of you found that the state ought to be paying for an EMIS coordinator? I think that's important, especially when the data is so critically important that your check from ODE is dependent upon this. It's a full-time position. It's all baked into the formula, technology. And my goodness, how reliant have we become on technology over the last few months? Point of the matter is, it is here, the whole student's education. So let's look at this base cost breakdown. Now, if you have that wonderful, and those of you at home might have it as well, colored piece, it looks like this. It's also up there. I want to walk you through this because it's critically important. So 60% of the base cost is direct classroom instruction. And that is based on research, it's based on best practice. And if you look over to the kindergarten, and this is an actual snapshot of a district, this is Trimble from a few years ago, FTEs, 20-1 kindergarten, 23-1 lower elementary, 25-1 middle school, 27-1 high school. This is not a mandate in that the local boards still have the option to choose how they would spend that money. Now let's look at kindergarten. Trimble had 57 kids in its kindergarten class, which means it needs funding for 2.9 teachers. Now I know there's no such thing as a 0.9 of a teacher. But every year, superintendents and principals sit down to figure out how they're going to juggle their teachers to match the demographics of a particular class. A larger class, you need more teachers. You might move somebody up a grade or down a grade. This allows you to do that. It's simply a funding formula. It is not prescriptive. Local control is baked into this. You have it. We are just saying that this is what the numbers ought to be based on a student enrollment count. Now, if you look at the head count at the bottom, you'll see 768. Go all the way down that middle column to under 12th grade, you have 768. I'm going to ask a trivia question here. In fact, I'm going to put your superintendent of Boardman on the spot. Can I do that? Terry, can I do that? All right, here's a question. Two districts side by side. Who borders Boardman? Canfield, 768 students. Pretend with me here. Boardman, 768 students. But Boardman has a greater base cost than Canfield. How can that be with the same number of students, grades K-12? Keep going. Hint, look at pupil-teacher ratio. What you were going to say, and I'm doing some telepathy here. I didn't ask the right question, so let me rephrase that. What you were going to say is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Boardman would have a younger student population, right? Shake it. Thus necessitating, I got it. There you go. He's got it. Genius. Absolutely. Why do I mention that? To have a little fun, but also to prove the surgically precise nature of this base cost. It's going to differ with every school district. Precise, based on student population and where they are with respect to grade level. That's the first thing to consider. Moving on down, specials, you'll see, 1 per every 150 students, a minimum of 6, 3 elementary, 3 high school, funded by the state. Pretty good, huh? And that would allow you not to make those difficult decisions with the specialists already baked in here. Of course, substitute teachers, professional development. This is direct classroom instruction, 60% of the cost right here. Now, there's more. Let's look at the instructional student reports. Athletics, critically important. And I love the cross-country course here at Boardman. It's critically important. I have a cross-country coach the last 12 years of my career. And I can tell you that I had a few runners who only came to school to run, and the classroom was secondary. But today one is serving honorably in the U.S. Air Force, and another one has been discharged from the service. They are fully functioning citizens, but you take away athletics, you take away extracurriculars, take away performing arts, and we wonder why kids might hate school. It's critically important. Remember that? Overall, whole life experience for kids. Athletics, co-curriculars here. High school guidance support is here. Amount per pupil, we've taken the statewide average for these. There is, ODE does allow us to compile these statistics. We took the average per pupil and put it in this formula. By the way, the average cost per teacher is important too. Let me back up a bit. We took the average statewide salary plus benefits, about 16% on top of that, and then insurance as well. So the real cost, not just salaries, the real cost is reflected in this formula too, so there's no surprises. Like buying a new car, you don't want any surprises. No surprise here either. Moving on down, back to instructional student support. Library, media, all calculated here. Social emotional security, 1 per every 250 students. This can be a school nurse, this can be a school resource officer. Again, whatever is important for your district, the funding is there for it. And then, of course, instructional technology. We figured out what it takes per pupil, Chromebooks every 3 years, 4 years or so, switches that you would need, all the information or all the components of technology baked into this formula per student amount. This is 15% of the total cost. Then you have to worry about the building. You need a building leadership. You would need a principal, right? You would need a secretary. You would need the operations, the janitors. And there is a figure in here for building operations and support. It's based on the square footage, and the superintendents are aware of this, square footage of the building multiplied by the number of kids, and you have a cost for that. All baked into building leadership. That's about 20%. And then finally, district leadership, superintendent, treasurer, EMIS coordinator, all of that is figured into this, and that's about 5%. So if people, how many of you ever walked door to door and knocked on doors for levies? All right, that's a wonderful experience, and if you ever hold public office, it's a staple of it, at least before this year. And how many times have you been told, well, you know what? You have too many administrators. You need to cut those people out. They're making too much money. In this plan, 75% of the base cost goes for the kids, 20% for running the buildings, and only 5% for administrative costs. Now, you can't argue with that. It's all here. It's all in the base cost. So what's this have to do with anything? In the DeRolf decision, some of the criticism levied was the fact that a base cost was never established. We have done that in this proposal, and that's critical, the base cost. So we would know from district to district what the cost would be for that particular district. Now we need to get on to the next little component. Next slide, please. So, people have asked, John, is this going to eliminate local levies? I'd like to tell you that COVID will be over soon too, but I can't. No, because constitutionally, the state and the local school district are responsible. There's a partnership here. Full disclosure, this will not remove local effort. But what it will do is provide for a fair local effort to be calculated. So let's get into that, the fair state and local share. Right now, and this slide's a little off, and this was another holding in DeRolf. 100% of a district's wealth is based on a district's property. Now, you might be in a district that's property wealthy and income poor. which means in the eyes of the state, currently it looks like your district has a lot of money. But when it comes time to paying it, if you have, in some cases, a lot of agricultural land and the farmers were hit hard, especially in Northwest Ohio a couple of years ago, remember the CAUV issues we had? Or let's pretend that a plant was shutting down, and let me do a fictitious name, let's say Lordstown. It skews what a district's local wealth is. So we have blended property wealth with income wealth. Property wealth with income wealth. About a 60-40 split. Now, you might say, how'd you get it? What's 60-40? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, in the state of Ohio, we actually have more income wealth than we do property wealth, about a third more. So to arrive at about a 50-50 split, and remember, I taught social studies, not math, so I'm going to do something really simple here. Think of a large pizza and a small pizza. And if we want to divide those up, I'm going to need, between a couple of people, I'm going to need to take less of that large pizza and more of that small pizza to come up with something that's equal for plate to plate. Does that make sense? So we take 60% of property, which is wealth, which is greater than our income wealth, 40%. Now there's another check here too. Within the income wealth, we are proposing to determine the local capacity, the 3-year average in that particular district based on the FAGI, on the federal tax returns. 3-year average, whatever of the 3 years is lowest, FAGI in that district, that determines part of the local capacity. That's 20% of it. The other 20% is the median of the most recent year available, the median FAGI for that particular district. That way we flatten this out, because if especially in a rural district, if one person wins the lottery or there are there's an infusion of oil gas wells or somebody sells a business that's large, it can skew the average. So that's why we've taken the median and the 3-year average and lowest to determine part of local capacity. Now, I'm going to get into something that treasurers will like, superintendents understand, and the rest of us, I include myself, kind of muddle through. We have to figure out what your local share in dollars would be. So here's how that's done. Figure out the property wealth, the total property wealth of a district, and divide by, Terry, this is your question, what are we going to divide that figure by? Numbers of pupils. So we've got that bucket. Property wealth divided by students. Average, 3-year average, lowest. Income divided by, say it again, Terry, numbers of pupils. And then the median divided by numbers of pupils. And then you add those 3 buckets together and you get the total local capacity per pupil. But wait, we're not done yet. That figures out a local total capacity. But I work for the state, and we have to figure out how that kind of compares to the rest of the state. So here's what we've done. And those of you who remember the old variable charge-off, this will sound very familiar to you. So we can take the median of all the median returns throughout the district, FAGI, for the districts, and compare your median FAGI against that in a ratio. And there's one other part of this magical calculation. We know that the average millage throughout Ohio is 22.5. And if we translate millage into percentage, our base then becomes 2.25%. With me so far? 2.25%, median of the district, median of the state, a ratio there. So here's how this works. The median of your district is to the median of the state as compared to 2.25, which is really the cardinal number 1. There are some districts that are going to fall below. So let me use an example, a concrete example. In your packet, you should have, and I think it's later on in the slides, jump ahead, quite a few to where the simulations are. I think it was in this one. Wasn't there a simulation in here? Yeah, here we go. Okay. Now, I'm going to use, because I have all the simulations here, you have the one from the front page, but let's follow this along. Adams, let's use that first. Adams County, Ohio Valley Local. They have 3,724 students now, but under the new formula, because we're going to pay them where they're educated, they show a loss of minus 4.3%. So if they're not going to get paid for those students, they're not educating. But here's the number we're really looking for. If you look over to column F, everybody can find F, you'll see the capacity per student, per pupil. It's the next number that is the multiplier index, 1.85. So Ohio Valley Local is challenged, if you will, because their multiplier index is less than 2.25. You would take 1.85 and multiply it times the capacity per pupil to come up with a number, and that becomes the dollar amount that a local district ought to be able to pay. Terry, did I say that right? Any questions about that? I know we have one treasurer out there. Am I good on that interpretation in layman's terms? All right. So if we know what your local capacity is in terms of dollars, and here's where the simplicity comes. If we know what your local capacity is in dollars, and we know what your local base cost is, then what's left to calculate? The state share. The state share is the difference. Think about this. No two districts are alike in their capacity. It's unique to a district. In the same vein, no two districts are alike in terms of their base cost. It's unique to the district. So that's why I am proud to say that this is surgically precise, based on your local capacity and based on your local base cost. And the state fills in the rest. Make sense? Once we get to that point. So, that being said, let's go back to that slide before we jumped ahead, where it says fair-based funding distribution. It's up quite a ways here, because we're going to get through that yet. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. And right there. So, currently, we're too dependent on property taxes, and we're blending property and income. And then your state share, the local share, is all dependent upon your capacity, your income wealth, your property wealth, to determine what then the state will kick in to help you. So 2 components: base cost, state, local share. But wait. There's more. Now we can go on to the next slide. Any questions so far? We're good. All right, then let's move on. Categorical aid. This is all outside the base cost. We need to look at poverty. You can go to the next slide. Preschool education, special ed, gifted ed, and ELL. So let's go to the next slide, and we're going to be looking at poverty in preschool. We know that there's significant challenges in Ohio. In fact, the number of kids in free and reduced lunch is outstanding. It's just astronomical level. And we also know that these kids cost more money to educate when you have the extras that they need. if they're not getting the support at home, if they come without the social emotional supports, if they need fed. We know these kids have special circumstances. So right now, we use a base of $272 in addition. This is all on top of the base cost, $272 per pupil. In those districts that are economically challenged, and there's a formula for this too, but I'll use a shorthand version. If a district has 100% concentration of economically disadvantaged, that 272 is actually quadrupled. It comes out to about $1,100 a student on top of the base cost for every one of those kids. Now, that's nowhere near enough. Research is all across the board. We searched for studies about how much it would cost to educate those students coming from poverty. A low at 26%, a high as 62% over the base costs. And these studies, one was done by a think tank in Washington, D.C., one was done in the state of New York, the other was done in the state of California. So what we did was to use as a target 30% of the base cost, knowing that we would need a study to really determine what it costs in the state of Ohio. And then by backing that out and doing some math magic, we arrived at a figure of 472. That is $422. That's a difference of $150 onto what we're doing now, so that when the 422 is quadrupled, it's about $1,680 per student, which is almost 30% of 60/20, which is our current statewide base cost. Now I know what you're thinking, John. Why didn't you go the distance? You settled for 3 yards in a cloud of dust instead of the Hail Mary. I guess the Arizona Cardinals would be thrilled with that Hail Mary reference this evening, if you watched that game last night. There's a reason for it. It costs a lot of money. In fact, I'll be the first to tell you, Al, I'm glad you're sitting down, $1.9 billion once this is fully phased in. $1.9 billion. We had to keep it under $2 billion to have any kind of a chance of getting real reform, quite frankly. And even that's going to be a challenge, especially with COVID. I'll get into how we're going to pay for it later. But it's a start. It's a start, and you have to think of this as a journey. It starts with this first step, and we thought that 30% with the current 60/20 would be a good way to slice that. Here's something else that's important too. The economically disadvantaged, all 4-year-olds who qualify as economically disadvantaged would be provided access to a year of preschool. It's that important. The biggest bang for our buck is helping these kids come into school prepared. The other thing we've done with respect to economically disadvantaged, those of you familiar with the formula know that there are various categories, and that when money is granted by the state, they must be spent on those categories, right, Treasurer? We have taken the governor's health and wellness language and inserted it right into the economically disadvantaged. For 2 reasons. One, it'd be nice if we could have some of that money, we don't need all of it, some of it going here to protect it. Because right now, the governor's health and wellness lies outside the formula. The next state legislature or the one after could just decide to cut the whole thing. By placing it inside, we've now protected it. So again, we've taken all those categories and put it into this general umbrella. All right. Next add-on, special education. We know we need to do a study here. The last study was done a little after the turn of the century, 2002, 2003. We are proposing 6 disability categories and a multiplier index of each. And here's from our treasurer. Treasurers out there, we'd increase the current funding from 90% to 100%, with the last 10% being set aside for the catastrophics. And you know how those can put a hole in a budget real quick, those catastrophic costs for these special ed students. So by putting that aside, it gives you a bit of a cushion. The other thing that we discovered, if a district gets really talented at educating special education students, guess what? You become a magnet school. And that can create challenges financially for any school district. So we think this is important. Next slide, or we're still on special ed. Gifted education. We're still on this one, sorry. We know that this is important. There's a study done, and we're proposing to implement that study. 3 different categories for gifted. I've been in touch with the gifted lobbyists. Obviously, it's not what they would like, but again, you have to think of this budget, especially when we get into transportation, as a massive Rubik's Cube. You fix one thing, something else goes out of kilter. Remember that $2 billion cap we have to stay under. And Rep. Katruna, remember, 1.9, 1.9, 1.9. Don't go over the top, right? So gifted ed, important, and we would include that. English language learners. We need another study for this. 3 categories here, and some background information. I was shocked to hear some of the numbers that were coming in. West side of Cleveland, Lakewood School District, 30 different languages spoken, 30. In Boardman, I'd say that you'd probably have a handful, probably Spanish, maybe some, right? A lot higher. 6 different languages here? 17 languages, all right. The winner that we found was Lakota, just north of Cincinnati, 50 different languages before dialects. Now, one of my favorite stories, but it's tragic, somewhere in the state of Ohio, a district had 2 students who spoke Burmese, and they called ODE to find out if there was somebody who could translate for these kids, who speaks Burmese that can help these 2 kids. And the response was this: speak slowly. Now, I'm a former teacher, and my goodness gracious, I'm going to pick on you from the ESC. You know, we have this thing called a report card, and our teachers are graded on the report card, and the districts are compared on the report card, but I'm going to give you, my dear friend, the 3rd grade reading guarantee, or the 3rd grade reading test. You ready to take it? All right. He said, sure. I didn't tell him what language. In Swahili. You're laughing. No chance. How can we expect these kids who are coming with us, all these different languages, do well on the state report card if we can't help them read and understand? That's stacking the deck, and that's what's happened. English language learners are a real challenge, and we are accounting for that in this school funding plan. And we do have kids who have those kind of challenges. Next slide, please. This should be transportation. Yes, it is. Now, if your head really wants to spin, we need to look at transportation, because it's not just educating kids, it's getting them to school. And there's been some real challenges here. Let me ask a question. Anybody know what a new school bus costs these days, besides superintendent treasurers? Shout it out. Okay, you can shout it. Go ahead, give us. $85,000. $85,000. We haven't had a joint state-local bus purchasing plan since 2009. So for $85,000, how many buses have you bought in that period over the last 10 years? A little over a half of one? All right. Boardman, how many have you bought in the last 3 years? Four this year?
We're starting to replenish our fleet.
Oh, good.
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 Many for years, but we have a plan, a 10-year plan.
10-year?
3-4 year.
That's good. Every one of those 85,000 buses that you're going to have to replace, you could buy a teacher for, couldn't you? At least one. We've been putting money into buses because the state hasn't been funding it, money that could have gone right to the kids in the classroom. We're proposing, again, a resurrection of that state local bus purchasing plan. and to get that moving as quickly as possible. We are also going to be looking to increase funds for special education transportation. Right now, it's a weird formula, $6 a day and some change beyond that. But we're proposing actual costs to be submitted to ODE and then apply the state local share index to it, which would put you at a much better advantage. We know, in addition to that, that buses are the safest form of transportation for kids coming to school. We are proposing to eliminate that 1 mile challenge to incentivize you to fill the bus. For safety reasons, some of your schools, and I know Boardman here, there's a 4-lane highway that kids would have to cross. But in other areas of the state, we're talking about federal routes, like Route 20 or so, we have schools on that are dangerous. And also, as one who taught at the high school, I never, ever went to my car until the students were all safely out, right? Not that we, as males now, and Terry, you're about 35, and Superintendent, I'm going to say you're about 31. I remember just about 10 years or so ago when the testosterone was flaring up, and you had that behind the car of that convertible, that 64 Mustang. We do weird things when we're growing up that we would regret later. I never, ever, it's a war zone out there. You know, you're doing a bus or a student parking lot duty after school. Would you agree? It gets kind of crazy. We want those kids on a bus, and the way to do that, in part, is to eliminate that 1 mile issue. Secondly, with respect to transportation, by law, you're required to transport non-traditional students. So we are proposing a factor of 1.5 for community school riders and a factor of 2 for the non-public students. You're responsible for them, you ought to be paid for them. And that would help relieve some of the tension between the traditional school riders and the non-traditional. We are looking at a 50% state share when it's fully phased in with respect to transportation. Also, along those same lines, a density requirement, density calculation. There are some districts who drive forever before picking up kids, not their fault, but a density supplement would be added using the eligibility 28 riders per mile and a median of 14 riders per mile. Separate transportation guarantee would be part of this as well. Next slide, please. ESCs. All right. So we did a study, the ESCs did a study. In fact, I was in touch with their lobbyists today. We're going to put our toe in the water here, and we have a 2-tiered funding system. A base cost for every ESC, $360-some thousand, I believe it is, and then funding for pupils, $5,000 to $35,000 would be almost, let's see, 20-some dollars. I've got it somewhere in my notes. $24.72, and then another roughly $6 for those ESCs, $35,000 and above. This is going to need more study, but definitely a step in the right direction because you were cut severely by the state over the last few years, and we need to get you back. Oh, by the way, as we phase this in over a 6-year period, the first bucket that would be fully phased in would be the economically disadvantaged students. Second bucket, fully phased in ESCs, and then after that, everything else on a pro rata basis. Career tech, you can see that there's going to be alignment with the traditional districts with respect to the descriptions, much similar to they are. This is the way they're funded, and the same with STEM schools. Now, let's go to open enrollment. Next slide, please. Community schools. All right. My treasurers, you'll like this. I'm going to say 2 words, and then you're going to say, yay. No deducts. All right, I heard a round of applause over here. Yes, no deducts. Direct funding. If we're going to have vouchers, if we're going to have ed choice, if we're going to have community schools, they must be funded directly by the state, no longer passing through your treasuries. That's the fairest, that's the most transparent way of going about this. If we really believe in choice, then we have to pay for choice and no longer playing the shell game on the backs of our local districts. So that's one of, there you go. Go ahead. You can, nice round of applause. I firmly believe that, So same with open enrollment. Now we've introduced some, there's some transitional aid here with respect to open enrollment. We know that some districts, we tried to make it revenue neutral. We think we have the fix for this in terms of moving money around. But again, in the long run, the money is going to flow to where the child is educated. And that seems fair too, because we have a number of school districts who are on the guarantee and are heavily on the guarantee, and we want to wean them off. Next slide, please. All right, this is obviously page 1 of the simulations. If you want me to explain anything about this, I can do so, but I'll hold off and get through the rest of this first. Go on to the timeline, next page. If you could, please. Next slide. All right. I'm headed to Columbus tonight because tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock we're in finance for the 8th hearing on the Fair School Funding Plan. I received word just before coming on stage that OSBA is now fully committed. Those of you members of OSBA have been in touch with Rick, and you're fully on board now to help this effort. OASBO, BASA, OEA, OFT, been heads up with the Chamber of Commerce, with the Ohio Municipal League, with the Ohio Association of Townships, Ohio County Commissioners Association, because those groups, and Ohio Farm Bureau and Farmers Union. This is also a tax issue too. If you know what your base cost is and what it will be as a school district, and you know what your local capacity is going to be, you will know precisely when and when not to go to the ballot. And that levy competition, when schools are on the ballots and the local fire, police, or cemetery levy, there is tension there. By having our schools on a predictable levy cycle. Now, I know you have to account for perhaps the non-passage, I get that, but it brings about a little bit more harmony in that levy competition for those scarce tax dollars that we all have to account for. So, this week, one hearing in the House, long one tomorrow. There was supposed to be 2 in the Senate this week. I just got word before we came on there's going to be 1 because of COVID. There's some issues down there in Columbus. But we're hoping to move this out of the House first, over to the Senate, and get this done by the middle part of December. Now, before we throw confetti and celebrate, a couple of things to consider. The obvious, there's no money with this. With the state budget, and you suffered through a $300 million cut already this year, this is a blueprint for the future, so that when future legislators tackle these problems, they'll know what the issues are, what they ought to be doing, and we can't tie their hands. They must make those decisions. I'm turned out, Senator Lehner's turned out, Rep. Scheer has turned out. We won't be there come January. I'll be watching you and waving at home from my couch, eating popcorn. But the time is now for this. The momentum has been building, and we can't let another generation of students go by without a proper education. And let me close. And I promise you that I get fired up here, all right? I've been kind of factual, and they tease me about getting emotional about this. Here's why this is important. I'll say to you that the future of Ohio is at stake. And let me explain to you why education is so important. There are three critical reasons. Number one is workforce preparation. No doubt about it. We can't have kids not prepared to go into the workforce. They need soft skills, they need to be intellectually curious, they need to be motivated, they need to be on time. All those things that we teach in school are important for this economy to survive. Nobody can doubt that. Secondly, it's important for the sustenance of democracy. I was thrilled to have in my district 71% of the people turn out. Turnout was heavy, but I won't be excited as a former social studies teacher till we get 100% turnout. Everybody should have a voice in this, and you can't be an educated citizen and not be able to parse, not be able to critically think, not be able to have a civil dialogue with others based on facts and not reality, or pretend reality in tweets. Sorry, I got a little emotional, Terry. But here's why it's so important. The first and last time that we're all in the sandbox together is in the public schools. When we graduate, we go our own way. And we typically tend to associate with those like us in social and economic terms. Now, I want you to think back to some of the kids you went to school with. Class clown, the overachievers, kids from the other side of the tracks. And think back of what you learned from them. Now, I graduated in 1974, and every 5 years we have a class reunion. And I'm thrilled that some of the kids that I learned most from are still living in the same town, but I grew to respect them. And here's where it comes. When we're in close contact with one another, we learn those skills of empathy. Empathy. I can feel because I understand. And when we have empathy for one another, and when we learn about fostering empathy, we then can have a civil dialogue about anything, even politics. But it's the empathy that's learned. Now let me give you an example about a civil dialogue. I mentioned I was married 37 years earlier, didn't I? There are times, and I hope this is not being broadcast into Ashtabula County. There are times when I do not walk on water at home. Any of you other males in that particular component with me? You don't have to say anything. Just look eyes ahead. No response. Now, in my Sunday school class, my men's class, we have a term for that when we need to be hearing and listening at the same time. I know that's hard for males to do. We call those moments of intense fellowship. Now, why is that important? Because if I don't have empathy, if I don't have civility with the one I love the most, how am I going to get through the tough times? And on a broader scale, if we don't hold this empathy and this civility dear to our hearts, how will we ever effectively govern ourselves? I liken it to a junior high dance. Now, I've chaperoned those. When we don't have empathy and civility, the boys go to one corner, the girls go to another, and there's nothing happening in the middle. But when we understand each other, guess what? You come to the middle. And I chaperoned proms as well when I needed a crowbar to keep them apart. You know what I'm talking about. That's how democracy ought to work. When we're that close together and we can have those disagreements, but we can work through it to get to a better day for all. We learn that in the public school. Empathy, civility, democratic experiment. But there's more. Workforce development, democracy. Here's why this is important. Uniting purpose and passion. And we do this in the public school. Purpose and passion. Terry, when you leave home in the morning, where do you go? What do you call that? No! Terry, what you really meant to say is, I'm going to Boardman today and I can't wait to get there, right? I'm going to school. That's right. I've never worked a day in my life. Have it. I went to school for 29 years. Now I get to go to Columbus all the time. That's not work, it's fun. It's because I found my purpose and united it with my passion. Your gifts and your calling. And we can do that in our public schools. Let me give you a real life example here, and then I'll wrap this up and open it for questions. Fall 1973, I'm a senior in high school. Principal came down to our study hall. First period. And at Jefferson in the old school, we used to have a courtyard, and the seniors got to go with you. If you had the good grades, you got to go outside in the courtyard. And I was ready to go to the courtyard, so were my buds. Principal said, boys, I want to start a home ec class just for boys. Now, this is 1973. How many hands went up? None. None, because, and I've changed this too, remember I've been married 37 years. I knew in 1973 who was going to be doing the cooking in my house. That was in 1973. Today it's 2020. Let's make that clear. And then he said the magical words. You get to eat whatever you make. How many hands went up? They all did. We're in. Semester course, boys home ec. Now, fast forward. I'm a dad. My wife let me at home several times with the boys. She trusted me from time to time. And we played a little bit too long. And she said, it's easy. There's macaroni in a box. Now remember, I have these massive skills learned from boys home ec, right? Macaroni in a box. She said, just follow directions. I can do this. I'm a man. I can follow directions. I can read. I've got a master's degree. I'm working on a PhD. I can handle this. Boy said, Dad, we're hungry. Can we eat now? So I'm thinking, yeah, we can eat now. What is a logical thing to do? I can have the time if I double the heat, right? Doesn't that make sense? Does to me. That's what I did. 576-3030 is a local pizza shop. I am terrible in the kitchen. It's not a gift I have. Even though I had boys home ec, I was better at eating whatever slop we created than I wasn't making it. It's not my gift. I learned that though. Spring semester, same principal comes down. Boys, got another opportunity for you. What's that, Mr. Braga? I want you to enroll in a personal typing class. Senior year. Cool, man. Graduating soon. Typing? Me? That's for 1974. We know. Then he said the magical words. This guy was a good salesman. I looked at the roster. Some of the cutest girls in school are in that class. How many hands went up? They all did. They all did. Those skills I learned in that personal typing class, I use every day today. So I ask you, what have we cut from our kids because we couldn't fund it? How many kids have not matched their passion with their purpose, that we've brought them in to take tests so that we could get a better report card, so that teachers could look good, be all at the expense of learning for learning's sake, and we wonder why kids don't like school, why the attendance rates are so bad, and why parents are upset with us. We must fund our schools to bring these programs back so our kids have those choices, so we can move Ohio ahead and we can have fully functioning adults. Are you with me? All right. Then I'll take questions at this point.
So anybody from the audience first? We're going to start there. They've opened it up online as well. So anybody who has a question? Okay, we've got the superintendent from Camel Schools, Matt Bowen, in the time it takes me to walk back here.
Hello, Representative. First of all, Matthew Bowen from the Camel City Schools. Thank you so much. We really appreciate all the hard work and all the time that you've invested into this, and we really have great hope moving forward. Knowing that this is a 6-year potential phase-in, We also are very dependent on the student wellness and success funds and those economically disadvantaged funds. With this being a phase-in and looking at the upcoming biennium budget, do those funds still have potential of remaining intact as this phase-in is considered?
That's an excellent question. And by the way, I've seen your simulations, and you have too. You were on the top of my list, you in Youngstown City.
Yes. And we've had the opportunity to work with Mr. Betts very closely,
Oh,
Jim Betts.
yeah.
And I've been on a number of calls with him, so we appreciate all your work.
He too called me just before we came in. So yes, the answer is economically disadvantaged would be the first bucket filled before we do anything else. Health and wellness dollars, that's going to have to, admittedly, we would like some of that to keep the cost down. Remember 1.9, we'd like to lower that a little bit, but we also highly respect what the governor has done, and it's critical for you to maintain that. So in my vision, now keep in mind, I won't be around next GA. My vision would be to blend those two, part protected in the formula, part with the governor, so there's more flexibility outside, same amount of dollars available for you, though, to have. And this is why this commission is so important. There's going to be, especially with COVID now, a need to constantly monitor what this formula does. It's a goal. We won't have any schools on the cap, and the goal is not to have many on the guarantee. Now, I can't say zero on the guarantee because there are always crazy things at work that might render a school on the guarantee, but that's the goal, eliminate both. And what you raise is a valid point, and we're very sensitive to that. Mm-hmm.
Anybody? Superintendent Saxton, did you have something? Yeah, I know that Terry Armstrong.
We did have a couple questions that came in
Please.
from the outside. This one comes from a school treasurer in Trumbull County. If the state approves this with a 6-year phase-in, what is the funding going to be like while it is being phased in? Would any district lose revenue?
The answer to that is no. Nobody would lose revenue. They just may not gain it as quickly as they want. Because remember, COVID has really played havoc upon the state budget as well. But nobody's going to lose. We made that point certain.
Next question. Mm-hmm. The commercial activities tax that was implemented in the mid-2000s set aside 70% of the revenue to reimburse districts for losses in tangible personal property taxes. These reimbursements are being phased out, with most districts already having been completely phased out of that locally generated revenue. Could revenue from the CAT tax be used to help fund the Fair School Funding Plan?
Well, I can't really, that's an excellent question. I can't really speak to that because now you're getting into taxation policy, and this is a pure school funding plan. I would think if I were in leadership, and I'm not, that I would be looking at all kinds of revenue generating ways that would allow us to make this investment in our students, and that could possibly be one. But I can't speak for leadership.
I have one additional question.
Yep.
That came in. For open enrollment, could you re-explain how that works? One of the questions that came up was, how is it that you're funding differently now compared to the old formula in terms of funding where the student's in school?
All right, and that's a good question, and we've had a number of conversations with respect to open enrollment. So I've got to go back through my notes and make sure I get this right. The funding will follow the student to the school where the student is being taught. And we also have baked into this a transitional period where those districts, and I'm going to get into something else too that is important here. Those districts who are losing a lot through open enrollment, we've made sure that they're not going to be penalized. And let me get into that right now, because it is a very delicate subject, especially in this area. Youngstown City Schools, 10,000 roughly people, students on their rolls, 5,000 they're educating. So we have built into this 3 tiers of targeted funding. So throughout the course of the phase-in, we've accounted for those districts where there's high student mobility and low economic capacity, so that they're not damaged, or so they're not limited in any way. So we have taken that into consideration. We know that's going to be an issue because we're moving from a formula, and I use that term loosely, formula, that is totally broken, to one that is predictable. There are going to be some bumps in the road, and we've had some long discussions about minimizing that transitional period for districts, especially with respect to open enrollment. And quite frankly, whenever we talk about open enrollment, and the potentially negative side of that, Youngstown is the district that we always come back to. We have to make sure they're held whole through this transition. It wouldn't be fair otherwise.
Representative Patterson, I have one that came in online from someone who's watching from Woodbridge Schools.
Woodbridge, yes, good cross-country team.
They want to know what specifically is needed from the community and citizens to get this over the finish line.
Well, that's an excellent question, and I am glad to answer that one. For starters, there's some quiet, shy guy in this row right here that you can talk to and surround on the way out, who would be more than willing, Representative Catrona would be more than willing to talk to you about this. But besides that, we need all of you who believe in this to reach out to your representatives and assure them that this is the right thing to do. Your state senators, there are some that still need to be convinced. And it's going to take all of us working together. And this is transparent. Before I came, my last call, before a few others that I had when I was sitting in the office preparing for this, I had a number of senators, in fact, the president-elect of the Senate, and there were some valid questions that were raised. We need to agree that this is important. We need to agree that we need to do it now, and then have these discussions, and we've already agreed with the president-elect to have these discussions to iron out some questions that he might have raised. Transparency is important. Urgency is critically important. So reach out to your state reps, state senators, and ask them to support this plan. And if they have any questions, if there's something they don't understand, if there is a mountain too high, let's work together to make sure this gets done. And working together, we can get this done.
Anyone in the audience? Mr. Sexton?
Do I tap dance at this point?
I think we just have a final, I don't know if
I
Mr.
can sing because I was in the band for all my years in high school, and that always is a thrill to be able to do that, and drama and anything else.
I think we just thank you for being here, sir. I know Mr. Saxton wants to close out. COVID. COVID protection.
Just a couple thank yous. I do want to thank our new treasurer, Terry Armstrong, who's been a welcome addition to the Boardman Local Schools. I love the fact of what he brings financially with his wisdom to our district. I like the fact that he's a former superintendent, so it doesn't feel as lonely in the office when you have someone to bounce some wisdom off of. So we're blessed to have Terry as part of the district, but really this was an idea that was born out of Terry's office and his financial mind. So Terry, thank you for helping pull all this together, and officially welcome to the Boardman Schools. Obviously, we want to thank Representative Patterson, because what he has done over these years to get this launched and get it to this point, out of respect, one, to our students, out of respect to all the work, the committee members, and especially Representative Patterson, it's now on our shoulders to talk to our local representatives to let them know how we feel about this and how important this is. I know for Boardman, being a cap district, first of all, that just every year losing roughly $3 million from a formula that says that we should get it, but they just don't have it. So maybe next year, maybe next year, maybe next year. What a blessed thing this would be if that was fixed. Also, I like to say we're property rich, but income average. And when we have great development here in Boardman, you need a place to eat or shop or do business, you come to Boardman here in the Valley. But we have also a decreasing student population. So the way the formula works is we're getting wealthier and smaller, so we're getting exceedingly rich, but our incomes in the Valley here in Boardman are staying average. So that formula definitely is not working for Boardman. So bringing in that 40% definitely brings in what we call fairness to a funding formula. So looking forward to see what can be done with this funding formula. So in closing, and out of respect to your time, I want to just say thank you for coming out here to the Performing Arts Center, for taking the time to invest in school funding, but ultimately this is about kids and it always has been about kids. So I thank you there's a lot of things you could be doing this evening. So I want to thank you for taking the time, for coming here, and also for the people that join us online, for taking the time out of your busy evening and listening and educating yourself, and hopefully going forward to advocate for fair funding and the students across Ohio. So thank you, stay safe, and be healthy.